Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome from ICICI Bank team Singapore. My name is Rajaram. I'm the Chief Executive for the ICICI office in Singapore. And on behalf of the team, extend a very, very warm welcome to all our esteemed guests for this session, India in a Goldilocks economy, stronger for longer. May I take the privilege to first introduce our guest of honor for today. We have with us His Excellency, the High Commissioner of India to Singapore, Dr. Shilpa Kambale. Thank you so much, sir, for being here with us. Sir, after his graduation from BJ Medical College, has completed his master's degree program in translation and interpretation in Chinese and English from MIS, Monterey, California. Joined the Foreign Service in 2002 and after learning Chinese language, spent 8 years in Beijing in the Indian Embassy working as 3rd, 2nd and 1st Secretary in the political wing and as Chief of Staff to the Ambassador. He has also served in the headquarters as the Deputy Head of the East Asia Division and as the Chief of Staff of the Indian Foreign Secretary from Jan 15 to 2018. After a brief stint as Deputy High Commissioner of India in Colombo from August 18 to July 19, he returned to Delhi and served as the Joint Secretary in the External Affairs Minister Office till 24th of June 22. Took over as Joint Secretary, East Asia in June 22 and continued to hold dual charge till 23 and currently is serving as High Commissioner to Singapore since July 2023. Thank you so much, sir. It's a pleasure having you here to grace the occasion. We also have with us senior officers from the High Commissioners, Mr. Saiyam Joshi, First Secretary for Economy, and Mr. Prabhakar, First Secretary on the Commerce side. Thank you so much, sir, for both of you all for making this event. Let me quickly take the opportunity to introduce the ICICI Bank senior management who are here. We have with us Mr. Sriram Hariharan, who is the Head of International Banking, NRI and Remittance Business. We have Mr. Vijay Chandok, the MD and CEO of ICICI Securities. And we also have Prasanna Balachandar, who is the Group Head Global Markets for ICICI Bank. So without wasting much time, I would like to invite Dr. Shilpa Kambale on stage. Can I have Sriram to just come on stage and welcome the chief guest with a bouquet, please? May I please request Saiyam sir and Prabhakar sir to also join and welcome, please. Sriram. May I request Dr. Shilpa Kambale to please.
Very good evening to all of you. Senior management from ICICI who've made time from Mumbai to come here. Local representatives from the ICICI Bank, my colleagues from the High Commission, friends and colleagues in the audience. Very good evening, and I think it's a very timely program we have today here. We've just kind of formed a new government in India. We've gone through elections in the last 2 years, and I'm very happy to note that we have the same Prime Minister now who's doing his 3rd term. We've almost the same cabinet. Most of the portfolios are with the same ministers. So it kind of gives out a very strong signal of continuity and stability both in terms of political stability and continuity in terms of policy. And though people and press might come out with different reports, I would like to re-emphasize the point that not since 62 or early 60s we've had a prime minister who's been elected for the third time in India. So this is somewhat unprecedented, and it is not without reason, because in the first two terms, in the last 10 years, a lot of work has happened in India, and a lot of delivery, last mile delivery has happened on the ground. So it is a reflection of the people's faith in this government and this prime minister that he's been re-elected for a third consecutive time. There's been a lot of focus on infrastructure development in the last 10 years, be it roads, railways, ports, airports. The number of airports have doubled from 75 to 150 in the last 10 years. We have an order of about 1,200 aircrafts placed by different airlines operating in India. So we are looking at being one of the largest civil aviation markets in the world, and also now trying to develop some transit hubs in India. The other focus has been on manufacturing. Everybody knows, I think people need to acknowledge that we somewhere missed the manufacturing bus about 10, 15 years ago. So there has been a renewed focus on manufacturing, because of which jobs are created. We have a production-linked incentive scheme in about 14 sectors. Some of these sectors have actually done very well: electronics, mobile manufacturing. Apple, in the last 2-3 years, has shifted most of its production back in India. And the incentives given by the government are really, really very good. So all people who are looking at going into India or investing into India, please do take a very close look at the PLI schemes in the manufacturing area, in the manufacturing sector. Also, we've, contrary to the perception that India is not going to participate in free trade agreements. RCEP was an exception, and there was a reason why we didn't participate in RCEP. But since that, in the last 4 years, we've signed not a free, we don't call it FTA, but we call it CICA and other terminologies, with UAE, with Australia, with Mauritius. One with the part of the European countries, which we call EFTA. We have one with Oman, which will be signed very soon, and negotiations are in the very advanced stages with the ones with UK and EU. So having said that, let me come to the India-Singapore relationship. I think ties are very good. We don't have any political issues between us. We don't have any difficult issues between us. Connectivity is very good. The financial and economic sectors are doing very well. What we had formulated about 2 years ago was an India-Singapore ministerial roundtable, where 4 or 5 ministers from each side interact over a day-long session, and which is combined with CEOs from prominent companies and institutions from both sides feeding into the session. We are trying to convene the second round of ISMR, hopefully in August, September, once our parliament session is over back in India. And this mechanism has identified 4 or 5 sectors where we are now focusing on. One is, of course, the whole digital framework. We have the UPI Pay Now link going on between India and Singapore. We are trying to expand it. The whole renewable energy and green growth sector, where we are also looking at green shipping channels and green hydrogen production and offtake agreements. We have the whole skills framework, where I think Singapore has a lot to contribute. We have a lot to learn from Singapore in that field, and we have collaborations there where we are looking at expanding it. One, of course, is the health sector, where we are looking at precision medicines. And of course, the whole food security part, where we are looking at investments from Singapore into some food sectors in India, which have an food security element as well. So overall, I think India is also in a kind of geopolitical and a geo-economic sweet spot. I don't know how long it will last, but I hope that we all make the most of it by the time we are in this spot. We are looking at a kind of stable economic growth of 8 to 10% for the next 10, 15 years. And we have actually shown that economic recovery post-COVID. And the economic growth rates in the last 3 quarters have been very promising. We do have a stable political environment as well as a stable policy kind of formulation. So if you're looking at the next 10, 15 years as a big market, which is looking to grow at such a high economic rate, I think India is the one where we need to kind of focus our attention. There might be some issues, I know, but the government in the last 10 years has made doing business comparatively easier, and the effort is still going on. And so I would urge all of you to listen to the presentation today and the group discussion which will happen later. And I wish this program and complete success. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ambale, and it was a real pleasure you sharing the insights and setting the tone for this conference. May I now invite Prasanna Balachandar, our group head for markets, to run through the house view in terms of what we feel about the Indian macros, and then followed by a quick fireside chat.
Welcome to all of you once again. Many thanks for taking the time out and attending this. We do sincerely hope that you will find the next 1 hour knowledgeable, value addition to you, and also have a little bit of networking between all of you. Many thanks, sir, for a wonderful introduction about what's happening in India. So let me start with a small, brief anecdote, if I can. So this is a presentation which I think nobody wants to hear, because everybody is anyway positive on India. And I think I'm going to bore all of you by saying more positive stuff. But then when we started making the presentation, and I had discussed it with Raja, we made it like, that was when the exit polls was there, and we said India in a Goldilocks economy, stronger for longer. And then we saw what happened on Tuesday morning. We were getting a little bit fearful about where the election results were going. So we said that, okay, let me call it as mandate for continuity, but with a change. And then finally, when PM Modi took office, we were back to the Goldilocks picture. So that's, I think, what is the story of how this presentation went. So this is a presentation with just 6 slides of content, but 3 slides of heading. So that's how we started. But nevertheless, I think Dr. Shilpak did a very good introduction, making my presentation almost redundant. But I will still, for the fact that we need to also look at some numbers, let me just talk about a few things. So if you really actually, for people who, if you take a time machine and you travel 1 week back and then you come back here to the future, you will probably think nothing has changed. That's what he was also saying, that you have the same prime minister and you have the absolutely almost 99% the same list of cabinet ministers. And that is why we wanted to call it as, this is actually a mandate for continuity, but with a small change. And in the next 10 minutes, we'll probably try and figure out what that small change, which could possibly mean, according to us, which can possibly, get ratified as we go along and see how the budget happens. But India's story, why do we call it as Goldilocks, is because both if you look at the short term as well as the long term, I think the story cannot be better than this. The first, when you talk about the Goldilocks macro picture, you typically talk about how growth is, how inflation is, how the external BOP situation is, and how the policy making scenario is. That's what we'll talk about here. And when you talk about growth, in terms of how the growth is, India's growth in FY24 was a GDP of 8.2%, and with a GVA of 7.2%. This is, I think, clearly by a huge measure, the fastest growing economy in the world, largest economy in the world. And when you looked at FY25, where does ICICI Bank think India will grow? We will probably have a GVA growth in the region of 6.6 to 7%, and this is on top of such a high base. And that is not anything to, that's not a mean achievement at all. And if you really look at the last 3-year average, we have been growing close to 7.7 to 8.3%, depending upon whether you look at GVA or the GDP. And FY24 GDP, mind you, has happened despite a very poor output in terms of agriculture, because we have been bailed out by a phenomenal growth in industry, which in turn has been led by, manufacturing and construction, and also services, which have kind of, compensated for this. And the concept of growth, if you really look at it and break it down, you can really look at it from either an investment perspective or a consumption perspective, and there are no prizes for guessing that this government has been driving investment growth, and that is what is actually, keeping up the kind of growth that India has seen over the last 2-3 years. And when you talk of investment, typically people only end up talking about roads, ports, and infrastructure and airports. But I think from an economic perspective, investments can be done by 3 sets of stakeholders in the economy. You have, of course, the government, which is playing its phenomenal bit in, expanding investment growth. You also have the real estate revival, which is effectively the investment growth of households. Because instead of spending, if they're actually, buying houses, that also has impact on investment growth, and that has a huge, ecosystem benefit about the kind of economy, which are kind of industries which grow. And then the third stakeholder who's also playing its bit, not enough so far, but going forward will do very well, is the corporates and how much they invest in infrastructure and how much they invest in capacity building, whether it is, factories and so on and so forth. So overall, I think it's going to be a thing where India is going to have much good, growth as we go forward. The second part of the macro Goldilocks scenario is the fact that when you have growth tearing at 8.2%, the thing that you can't hold back is inflation. And if you really look around the world, I'm sure you will be aware that whether it's in the US or whether it's in Europe or where any other country, you have inflation which is so high and growth which is less. But India is exactly the opposite, where you have a tearing growth, but you have inflation which is very well contained. And if you look at the components of inflation, the story is even better. You have headline inflation at 4.5%, but core inflation, which is what typically goes up when growth goes up, is only at 3.1%. And so that is, I think, the beauty of what this government did, which is to show the growth or propel the growth to investment-led growth. And what it is possibly doing is to increase the potential growth of the economy. So when potential growth of the economy increases due to infrastructure building, due to investment-related growth, it gives the ability of the economy to grow at a higher rate at a lower inflation without really pulling up inflation. And when inflation doesn't come up, you obviously have a lot of benefits. You don't need to hike interest rates. You can actually have a easy interest rate scenario even when growth rate is so high, and that will help you, pick up jobs as we go forward. So I think that is one very important facet which has been achieved by this government also, which is to say that you got a good growth rate, but you also have a very low inflation rate. And then when you continue the story on to the macro picture, look at what's happening on the balance of payment side. So typically any economy where there is heavy growth, or when any independent economy, it can never be truly independent, because your currency and your exchange rate is always linked in a relative world to how rest of the economies are performing. So it's quite possible that if you have policies which are very much insulated from the rest of the world and you are on a different path, your currency can be the conduit, and it can give away sometimes, and there could be sometimes a run on the currency and so on and so forth. But the beauty is we have had high growth, we have had low inflation, and we have had an external situation which is the balance of payments, which has been absolutely phenomenal. So if you really look at 2013, which is when India was last called as a fragile five, you had a growth rate which was very similar, but you had an inflation rate which was very, very high. And that was a time when trade deficit was at 6.8% of GDP, very similar to where we are right now. But the current account deficit was 4.8% of GDP. Then we are only at 0.7% of GDP. So that goes to show that the earnings of the countries, the ability of the country to earn dollars has been so good that especially from whether it's from remittances of NRIs or from global in-house centers where MNCs are setting up shops in India, I think the investment climate has also been so good that there has been enough earnings of dollars that has actually helped the country to grow their external deficit quite well. And this is not only encouraging foreign direct investments to come in, but even the foreign portfolio investments. It's either equity FPI flows which comes in on the capital side, or you see on the debt side where India has recently been included in the bond index platform. So because of that, we get a lot of bond index flows as well. So either which way you cut the piece, we are looking at a BOP surplus of $50 billion next year, maybe even growing up next year even more, depending upon how our external situation moves. And the fourth piece in the macro picture is what we sometimes call as the twin deficit. I mean, you have current account deficit as one of the problems in an economy potentially, and you have the fiscal deficit as another problem. Here again, if you see, the government has actually done very well in terms of the way they have actually, they didn't spend when COVID was at the peak, when they knew that whatever spending they did is just going to land up in the households' hands and they're not just going to spend it. They waited for the COVID thing to get over or kind of get relaxed, and then they started, spending. And that too, where did they spend? They spent on infrastructure and capital expenditure. So I think that is something that, helped us very well. And again, if you see the interim budget, they have clearly gone into the path of fiscal consolidation, and that is exactly at the right time, because as all of you know who are following global markets, the US is a country where you have a very high fiscal deficit, and that is actually undermining a lot of other good policy measures that has been taken there. So I would say that even on the fiscal side, I think the twin deficit problem is now history, and at the right time, the focus has been brought on fiscal consolidation. And the last piece as far as the macro is concerned is what is RBI doing and how is the monetary policy situation in the country. So if you really see, again, Reserve Bank of India has done a fabulous job. If you look at the economic cycle or the interest rate cycle and what happened in the rest of the world and plot it with respect to what happened in India, I think RBI has done two things. One is they started hiking rates post-COVID earlier than the Fed. And second, they started tightening liquidity earlier than when the Fed started tightening. So what this has clearly done is to keep inflation in a lid again. Just like how the government has done a fabulous job in terms of spending on capital expenditure and not on revenue expenditure, the RBI has also done the right things at the right time by ensuring that we don't see a runaway inflation happening. So while typically a favorable macro situation happens when the Reserve Bank is about to cut rates or has been cutting rates. But here we are seeing a situation where the Reserve Bank has not even started cutting rates, but the global our growth and other situations are so favorable. So very recently in the policy, I think the governor did speak about 2 or 3 things, saying that they don't want to follow the Fed and also the fact that they're going to come out with a neutral rate. So something tells me that we are in a in a period very, very close to where the interest rate cuts are going to happen, maybe towards the end of this year. And that will also have a lot of salutary effect in the way, growth transpires over the next few years. Now, let me kind of come to the last section, which is basically what are the structural, I did speak about the growth, inflation, current account and all that, but what are the structural reasons why India is doing well? So this is where we thought that this was an election verdict which had a lot of continuity with some small changes. I think if at all, the only change that I think the government is possibly going to do is the fact that number one, they have an ally in Mr. Chandrababu Naidu, who was known as the original reformer in the 90s period. So I think there will be a lot of of meeting of minds. In fact, I do agree with him that there is a lot of case for stability of this NDA government, and it was a pre-election alliance and not a post-election alliance which searched for power. I think that is another important thing. If at all, the only change which I think is going to happen is possibly the fact that there could be a little bit more push on consumption, especially from the fact that you need rural economy to also, develop as well as what is happening on the urban side. We do know that there is a little bit of lesser growth that has happened on the rural side, but of late we are getting some high frequency data which kinds of indicate that the rural economy is also doing well. But it is reasonable to expect that there will be some spending programs which will, happen on the rural side. But I'm very confident that that is not going to happen at the expense of fiscal consolidation. And the reason I'm saying that is also because I think with the kind of tax collections that India has seen, with the kind of the dividend that the Reserve Bank of India paid the government very recently, the degrees of freedom that this government has in terms of deciding, they have a largest of nearly 0.4 to 0.6% of GDP, with which they can decide to either reduce the fiscal deficit from 5.1%, which is what they have stated in the interim budget, or they can, spend on consumption-related stuff and, welfare schemes and so on and so forth before they, kind of reduce the fiscal deficit. So I'm pretty confident that they will use a judicious mix of both, which means don't be surprised if, even though there are welfare schemes which are announced in the budget, you will still have a fiscal consolidation at 4.9 to 5% of GDP, though they have actually predicted it to be 5.1%. And having spoken about welfare schemes, also I think our bank's view is that this is not a government which will spend on schemes which are just as an outflow or as a transfer, like how, Mandriga scheme was used in the past. I think the way this government thinks is to have real asset creation and real employment creation. If at all there was a message in the verdict, it is possible that people are saying that let's look at instead of jobless growth, let's look at a growth which is driven by job growth as well. So from that perspective, I think the kind of welfare schemes that this government will possibly come out with will be schemes which are either linked to asset creation or which will be linked to employment growth, just like how a PLI linked scheme is related to the production aspect of it. Other than this, I think there is pretty much very minimal changes that is going to happen, and we believe that India is in a long-term path for growth. So I think I'll not go through each of the individual factors. I've already spoken about the minimal change. What will not change, and the factors which are driving, is demographics. India is as young as you can get and getting richer as we speak. Infrastructure growth that we spoke about, whether it's in airports, ports, railways and all that. Government, corporate and real estate, all the three aspects of investments driving India's investment-led growth. Premiumization on the consumption side. So as India goes from a 2,500 per capita to 5,000 per capita, there will be, it's at an inflection point where there will be a lot more type of products which will get consumed in the country, and that will lead to a lot of growth in the country. I mean, like, for example, the kind of travel that is going to happen, the kind of two-wheelers and the kind of, four-wheelers that are being purchased, and the kind of houses. We did speak about how, luxury housing is also, taking up in a big way. So I think all of this is a result of premiumization. Geopolitics is again something, like is rightly said, is in a sweet spot for India. In fact, every development which could have been a crisis has been converted into an opportunity over the last 2 years. So I don't see any of that changing. Digitization, I think UPI is talked of most often in the world as a classic example of what other countries can follow. In fact, now with PayNow and UPI, the kind of joint venture, I think that is also something that will take up much beyond what one can imagine. The global in-house centers which are, developing in a big way. Whenever we go and meet MNCs all over the globe, either there are three types of MNCs. Companies who have set up already a GIC, companies who are just about to set up, and the third are companies who have not set up but are very, very worried about the fact that somebody else in their industry has already set up a GIC in India and why they have not done. These are the three types of companies. So India is very much a part of the boardroom story wherever we go. Tourism is again another stuff which is going to really, expand as we go forward substantially. And the last bit is on financialization of savings. Vijay is, of course, there in the panel discussion. I'm sure he will talk at length about it. The kind of impetus that financialization of savings, whether it's on bonds, whether it's on equity markets, whether it's on the kind of investments that people are doing and supporting the capital market in India, is something that we have not seen in our lifetime in the past. And what it does is to bring a very good amount of risk culture in the economy, with which the corporates who are in the past using debt-fueled growth to build infrastructure are today able to share their equity risk. I'm talking about promoters. They are able to share their equity risk with the people at large, because there are so many people who are today willing to take up the equity culture. So I think these are all some of the structural changes which are happening in the economy, which is not going to change, and which is also going to go further fast forward as the Prime Minister has taken charge, and with a very, very similar cabinet that we had earlier. So with that, I think I'll stop, and lots to discuss. Hopefully Vijay and will throw some light into what happens in terms of the economy as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prasanna. May I now invite Vijay Chandok, MD, CEO of ICICI Securities, to join us on stage for the Fireside Chat, please. So, I think the presentation broadly covered a lot of the pointers. I think many of them would be available in public domain. Many of them would have got researched. In fact, the enthusiasm with which the election results were being tracked, we were thinking whether we are too early for this session, too late for this session, but then I was sharing with Prasanna that on 4th evening when the results were getting declared, before the results were getting declared, I got a webinar invite. So people were all set that what is going to be the narrative for the election results. But I think now the verdict is out, and I think it's a good time to really introspect of what's in store. So Prasanna, let me start with you. We had the discussion on global growth, fiscal and monetary policy outlook. I think from a US Fed perspective, higher for longer is there, and that's having an impact on the broader emerging markets. So pointed couple of questions. How many cuts do you see from Fed and ECB this year? When do you see the emerging markets really looking at that as the next step? Because obviously the currencies have been largely under pressure for the last 1 year or maybe even more. And how comfortable is RBI currently placed given the global backdrop and the new election outcome?
So I think, first of all, I also have to tell you that when you track a global economy and the US and all that, it's been like that movie Groundhog Day, where every day Bill Murray wakes up in the morning and he relives the same day every day, day after day. So similarly, all of us have started last year beginning saying recession abhi aayega and US Fed will cut rates. And the same thing didn't happen the entire of last year. And the beginning of this year also we started the same, and we are already in the middle of the year and still recession is nowhere in sight and rate cuts are nowhere in sight. But anyway, I think the reason why the Fed is, the US economy is really strong is because one of the reasons actually is they have really gone on a fiscal pump priming. There's been huge amount of fiscal spending that they have done. And the second is, there is also a lot of geopolitical reason in terms of what they call as friend-shoring or reshoring, where they want to diversify their global value chains away from countries like China, if I can say so, into their own domestic shores. We do talk about China plus one as a benefit for India, but the US usually talks about friend-shoring and reshoring. So that is another reason. So these two, plus the third, which is that immigration has been used as a very powerful tool where they get people into the country, and that has actually led to a lot of GDP growth. So the US is doing much, much better than what we all feared right from the beginning of the last year. Now, data of in the last 1 month or so has started cooling down. It's not going to be a crash or a recession like people feared initially. I think we can safely say that there is going to be a soft landing of the US economy. And the Fed has started, acknowledging that there is a slowdown which is, happening. So what we think is going to happen in terms of rate cuts is that the Fed is either going to cut once, or if we are lucky, they might cut twice, which means it's either 25 basis points or 50 basis points. And the reason I'm saying that is, again, data is coming a little mixed. In 1 month, you get a very strong set of economic data. Another month, you get very weak data. People who are here tracking global markets will know that for sure. In fact, last 2-3 days itself, it's been, changing around. So with that kind of a background, emerging markets, and with the Fed economy being so strong and with the dollar being generally strong, emerging markets have not been able to, kind of cut rates, even though they would have otherwise wanted to do, because they cannot afford to cut when, US dollar is so strong, and then the inflows into these emerging economies will not be able to, come very strongly. So I think that is where, our situation is. India being an emerging market, even though the fundamentals and the macro picture is so strong, we will be bracketed along with other emerging market countries. So it's very difficult for our governor to, or the Reserve Bank to think about doing something when the rest of the economy are going against you. Having said that, in the most recent policy, he did say that we are not going to follow the Fed. Now, is he going to be very serious about it? I don't know. We'll have to wait and watch. According to me, there is no gain for the economy by cutting rates ahead of the Fed. It doesn't do us any great. Anyway, we are doing very well. There is no need for a rate cut. So I do feel that they will wait for the Fed to cut rates. Maybe 50 basis points of rate cuts you will get for the Fed, and maybe 50 basis points from ECB.
Vijay, Prasanna spoke about the global rate cycle and India's rate trajectory. From a market's perspective, India has seen large amount of FPI inflows the year before, but obviously that number seems to have come down in the current year. How do you look at the markets going forward in terms of both the inflows on the domestic as well as the FPI flows which are coming in, and also which are the sectors which, according to you, will really be the next kind of gaining sectors or momentum in this market?
Thank you very much, Raja. Let me first and foremost take this opportunity and wish everyone a very good evening. Good to see old friends. I'm coming after a long time to Singapore. Pleasure to reconnect with you. It's been a while, I suppose. Raja, you spoke about the position of Indian capital markets and outlook. And in the first session that we heard, and also Prasanna's session, massive explanation has been done about the macros. I'll just pick up, and I think that becomes the underlying fabric because they are drivers for growth for capital markets. So from a capital markets and their ability to attract capital, I think some of these are particularly important. I just want to highlight 5 factors which I think are particularly important for capital markets growth. The first one is we spoke extensively on macros, but what investors really love when we talk about macros, not just India is a high growth economy, a large economy, but also the fact that it is pursuing decisively a fiscal consolidation path. They love that. The second thing is about inflation. Again, inflation is been troubling the developed world and even the emerging markets in a big way, particularly after massive infusion of money that has taken place post-COVID. I think India has managed that situation extremely well. And when you look at the combination of inflation growth matrix, I think India scores extremely well. The third aspect which really the investors like about capital markets, about the economy, is what I call a triplet balance sheet strength. Today banks are in a ship shape in India in terms of asset quality, in terms of liquidity, in terms of capital. And they are important, providing important growth momentum to economic components. The second is household balance sheet. I think that's also in good shape, providing consumption momentum. And the third is the government balance sheet. Again, in good shape, so they're able to infuse a lot of capital for growth, particularly infrastructure. The fourth factor, which is in terms of policy, and we spoke about the policy measures taken, which is fundamentally made India far more efficient economy through digitization, through improvement of infrastructure and so on, and that journey continues. I think there's reasonable confidence now to say that we'll probably continue that path of improving the economic efficiency there. And lastly, I think Prasanna touched upon it, is the demographics. People, investors really like the fact that this growth momentum is not a short-term 2, 3 year, 4 year story, but it could be a much longer story. So I think that's all, whether you talk to DIIs, the domestic institutions, or the foreign institutions, I think there is a universal acknowledgement of that fact. And it is probably because of this reason, the markets have really attracted massive amounts of capital. Last year was a record year. Through various instruments, corporates in India raised close to 1.8 trillion rupees, which translates to about approximately $25 billion. It was a record year, I think all-time record. Different instruments, different industries, different categories of instruments that raise this money. The other unique thing about the Indian market is that we've started seeing solid, I would say, what I would probably call core flows. This is coming in form of the SIP culture, which has become so popular. And add to that is the mandate given for the pension sort of instruments and funds that invest in the market. You add these two together, we are talking of 3.5 trillion rupees run rate, on annualized run rate basis of flows coming into the market, which is like going to keep happening year on year and probably just grow from there. So that's close to 40 plus billion dollars. So just imagine, it's reasonably large in the context of markets, and this is coming. That's probably, this explains one of the reasons why, despite the point that you were raising, the FIIs not participating in a big way this year, we've still seen markets hit record highs because there is so much of domestic support of money which is coming in. That said, question that keep asking as to how do you see the outlook in terms of money returning? I think, again, when we talk to FIIs, they seem to say that India ticks all the boxes. Then still, why is this money not coming? The common refrain is India is an expensive market. But then one has to view India in the context of the growth dynamics that gets associated with the high valuations. And our own sort of thought processes that a lot of FIIs have started, some of them are waiting and watching. When you look at multiples to earnings, I think somewhere around 18 times we believe is the market bottom, which means that Nifty, if you are tracking Nifty, 20,000 is probably the bottom. And in case Nifty ever goes to that number, you'll see a huge rush of money. That could be another trigger. Prasanna spoke about the US path of interest rate change. If that happens, that's the other swing. And of course, the third point is, despite all that we may say, sitting here and talking about the expected outcome from the elections remaining stable, policy, etc., I think investors want to watch. So they will watch for signals, and once they get convinced, I think, again, there is going to be return. Indian markets are ready to absorb. As we speak, I can see close to 1 trillion rupees of pipeline already sitting. Maybe after the budget, all of them will swing into action through the IPO market. So a lot of action expected, and I'm pretty optimistic about FPIs also participating going forward.
Just the irony that FPIs are finding the Indian market expensive, but the Indian consumers don't believe so. Because the SIP investment has just been hitting the roof, started with 5, 10, 15, and now 20,000 crores a month. I think that itself is a huge sense of belief on the ground that, and especially the financialization which Prasanna you were covering, I think that's really picking up momentum, and I think you can see a lot more of that happening. Prasanna, from our lighter side that we shared, that we have 3 slides on how we want to present, and then or 5 slides of what the data is. But continuity and change, I think that was the key that we really recognized and said that this is what it is going to be. The government has been focusing on CAPEX, upgrade in terms of infrastructure, PLI scheme, improving the manufacturing competitiveness. But the mandates also suggest that now it has to be faster acceleration, which is required for job creation and rural consumption. So from that perspective, especially keeping in mind that the consumption has not been really performing, or let me use the word underperforming over the last couple of quarters or years, what will be the mandate and key priorities for the current government for these segments?
So in terms of the continuity and change, I think one other thing that we can all rejoice from an Indian perspective is the fact that if you remember before the elections, there was a lot of doubts which are being asked about the quality of democracy, whether people will be, what about the EVMs, are they really going to depict the truth? At least this result clearly shows that democracy is alive and thriving in India, and I think that deserves a big, thumbs up as far as investors are concerned. But in terms of, I think the change, the Prime Minister can still surprise us, but I think there are some reforms like, land reforms and those kind of, a little bit more hardcore reform orientation where they might go a little slow. There was an expectation that it's quite possible that, those are the reforms that a government would do in the third 5-year term. Maybe they will go slower on that. But to answer the question on consumption versus investment, I think the typical, trade-off is that consumption driven growth gives you immediate bang for the buck, because when you transfer money, they come and spend on the market and you get the GDP impact in the same year. Whereas investment, you get a little delayed and you get over a longer period of time. So the trade-off is immediate short-term versus long-term. It's been very clear that this government works on the long-term, and that's why they have been doing a phenomenal amount of capital expenditure over the last 3 years, going from 1.5% of GDP to something like 3.5% of GDP. But the good news is that since the Reserve Bank has given a big largesse and the kind of compliance that is led to a huge amount of tax buoyancy and increase in tax collections in India, has given the degrees of freedom to this government to do a bit of both. In fact, do a bit of all the three, which is fiscal consolidation, capital expenditure, and consumption-driven expenditure. They can do all of that, and that's the beauty at which this government is currently placed. And that is why I'm pretty sure that they will go a judicious mix of all of this. They have stated that they are going to be at 5.1% of GDP, but if you are to take the RBI extra dividend plus the extra tax collection that happened over the last couple of months, they can easily show up to 4.6 or 4.7%, but they will probably end with 4.9, which basically means that they are using some degree of freedom to, end up giving a little bit of consumption push. And the beauty about consumption push, like I said, is that it will actually have an upside bias on your GDP growth rate, because the benefit of that consumption can be seen immediate. In fact, I remember in the early 2000s, whenever a farm loan waiver happened, mutual funds used to be very bullish about it from a FMCG perspective, that this will lead to a lot of buying, because suddenly you have farmers whose loans have been written off and who can actually come and consume. I'm not saying that is a policy that this government will follow. All I'm saying is that a consumption-driven push will have immediate bang for the buck. So there is an upside, that can result in higher level of GDP growth as well. Most of the other things that we spoke about, I think it is very clear that they are going to continue with that, whether it's the railways, roads, the minister is the same, the policies are going to be the same, ports, airports, everywhere, I think it's more or less going to be the same. So I think we are going to be seeing a situation where not only will investment push happen, but we will also see consumption also coming back.
So it will be a fair bit of maybe continuity in terms of the infrastructure, capex, push for the growth, and maybe a little bit of populist measure because of the
absolutely
ground level realities that this election.
So I think what people do is to just compare what was a Y-on-Y growth in capital expenditure 2 years ago, 1 year ago, and this year. The fact of the matter is you have already grown from 1.5% of GDP to 3.5% of GDP. So from now onwards, the incremental Y-on-Y growth in what the government spends is cannot be too much. And bear in mind that the amount that they are spending on capex is as much as 11 lakh crores. And it's not easy to execute that as well. So that is why I'm saying that I think market is underestimating today the effect of this, capital expenditure that will happen. plus the fact that there are extra degrees of freedom that can be used with the government to spend on other areas as well.
So Vijay, just to connect the dot, I think the strong base effect. So from that side, I think the domestic inflows into the equity markets, just as we touched in the previous question, that it's already 20,000 and we are expecting to go cross these numbers. But what is your view on the Indian market when it comes to the medium term kind of perspective? And more importantly, two questions. In terms of how do the retail individual Indian investors look at these kind of corrections or jerks that we will have, like what we have seen in pre and post election, that will trigger any kind of decision making process. And obviously very keen to hear from you, like what is the flavor in terms of the sectors which will be most sought out for?
So let me stick my neck out here. You talked about from a medium-term perspective, what could be the outlook. So we do at our company an exercise where we look at the Nifty companies and we do a projection of their EPS. This is something that we've been doing year on year. So for the year which ended, 2024, our EPS projection was about 960. I think it turned out more or less on dot. 960 or 980 was the range of the actual EPS that's trooping in now for the Nifty. Our 24 and 25 projections is somewhere in the 1080, that is 1080 rupees of EPS and 1250 rupees of EPS. So 1 year down, our house view on Nifty is that we should be somewhere in the ballpark of 25,000. So we are at about 23,400 and odd today. So we believe that we could be somewhere in the 25,000 1 year hence. If you track Sensex, then that translates into something like 83,200 and odd. So that's where we believe the markets are probably headed. Of course, don't hold me for it. It is at the end of the day an estimate, but we are sticking our neck out to give that as a guidance. As far as domestic participation is concerned in financialization, I think we spoke about it. How do these investors see which sectors, etc. We believe that a lot of the domestic flows is structural. It is not something which is transient. Why do I say this? I think the entire move on digitization that has been invested in the last several years has started playing out post-COVID in a very, very meaningful way. You spoke about systematic investment plan. That's one manifestation of these flows. 20,000 crores of Indian rupees, that's about $2.5 billion per month of flows. That's about $30 billion of annual run rate of money coming from retail investors. Which type of retail investors? These are people not sitting in Bombays and Delhis alone. Of course, they are from these cities, but from the larger Bharat. These are youngsters. The average ticket size of these investments is just rupees 2,500 only. What does it mean? This is not money which is lumpy. This is granular. This is coming from large number of people who believe in the India story and are investing in India for wealth creation over a long period of time. So this is not going to disappear in a rush. $2.5 billion is literally a flow which is a given. One needs to keep these technical factors in mind when you're looking at the Indian markets. The second thing is direct participation into equity. That's another big trigger. The number of demat accounts, which used to be about 35 million 3 years back or 4 years back, is today at 150 million. So there's been a 4x increase in the last 4 years. Of people coming and participating in Indian market. And we are still under-penetrated when you look at it in relation to some of the other economies. A lot of these people are directly coming and investing in markets. So clearly, these flows are structural. They are not transient. We have seen episodes of volatility, for sure, which is characteristic of any capital markets. And we find that every dip, every volatility is bought into. Somewhere I feel that this time around, this money is a little more what I call fearless money. In the past, when people entered, they saw the markets fall down, they sort of rush out. But thanks probably to social media, education, the stuff that happens through various YouTube channel gurus who teach, they've given out so much of data, and the narrative that is being built with these youngsters and investors is that in every fall, add. Now, you could argue and ask me whether this is right or wrong. If you believe in the India story, if you believe in the fact, and these are guys who are putting money in SIPs, systematic investment plans, and these are all well-regulated mutual funds who are the recipients of this money. I think it would be not something that would cause concern that such advice that is being given. So the money is fearless and more money is coming. Where is this money going? Which sectors could be the beneficiary? To our mind, right now there's a tactical play. I think given the outcome of the elections, consumption is one theme which has got some legs coming back to it. Our till recent guidance on consumption was that it's a K-shaped recovery. Probably with some changes that could happen through or some further welfare measures that can be taken, this can be a slightly more broad-based U-shaped kind of a recovery. Early signs of that is there, which means that themes which are premiumization themes certainly would do well. Things like transportation, things like hospitals, things like auto. These are high growth sort of areas with more legs to go even now. The beneficiary of the US soft landing plus the rate cycle, I think would be IT could be a beneficiary. Pharmaceutical could be another defensive play in the current context. Consumption-based NBFCs could be another play. So these four would be more from a here and now tactical positioning. But if you're looking at long term, I think the pivot moves back to infrastructure, to power. There's a huge demand for power. If you look at defense, the companies are sitting on massive order book positions. That's not going to change. Power consumption is growing at 8%. There's a massive outlay of investments in the power sector, which is another going to be a big driver for growth. The entire premiumization theme, the auto theme. So all these sectors would continue to dominate from a more long-term perspective. I know a lot of valuation has already been sort of taken up by these companies, but look at the earning momentum that these could potentially display. I think there is a lot more legs if one takes a more medium-term view.
I was just remembering the pre-conference chat that we were having at HiCom, and we were discussing about the number of demat accounts. I remember the start of COVID, the number of demat accounts which started really jumping leaps and bounds. I was handling the mutual fund industry at that time. With one of the Cs, I was just chatting, saying that this is a threat, like the money is going directly, demat accounts getting opened, direct participation in equity. And the C just said one thing to me. He said, this is work from home, word of mouth getting spread, something to be done when you're sitting in the home and you don't have much on the office palette to look out for. But he just told me one thing, that keep in mind after 1 or 2 years, when they see 1 or 2 blips in the market, this entire money will come to mutual funds through SIPs. I think one of the factors for that, maybe the youngsters coming back into the office fold have not been able to really put that kind of money, time and effort to really look into the markets, and I think for them this looks like a good option to keep investing. Prasanna, a lot of positives in terms of monsoon predicted well, the Goldilocks factors, whatever you spoke. Equity markets are also giving that kind of a thumbs up because the volatility was only for 72 hours and it just came down and then again rose up, and now we are, as we speak, I think we're almost coming to a nifty high in terms of the equity markets. But what's your view on the India's medium-term growth trajectory? How do you look at that progressing over a period of time?
No, I think pretty much similar to what we have already discussed in the presentation and what Vijay also had to say. I think markets and economy nowadays are so closely linked that very similar to most of the sectors that Vijay spoke about are the ones that's going to, I think, drive India's medium-term growth. whether it's going to be IT, whether it's going to be the global in-house centers from an inflation perspective. So banking is, of course, something that whenever a country does well, the banks have to do well. There's no doubt. Whether markets also treats the banks similarly or not is a different question, but at least the banks will surely do well. One or two things which I kind of wanted to also make a point is that, interestingly, if you would if you looked into the first 7-8 years of this government, there were a lot of talks about divestment and privatization, and at that time, I think somewhere around 2 years ago, they shifted the narrative to making more value out of the existing public sector undertakings. So today, we don't talk about privatization, but we are talking about how this government can, let's say, fire from the shoulders of public sector undertakings to get a higher growth. So you see a NTPC, you see a Power Grid, you see a NHAI, they're doing phenomenal amount of work, which is not HAL, BHEL, BEL. So you don't see the, you can't, there's a common saying, right? You can't take a horse to the pond, but you can take a horse to the pond, but you can't make it drink. Similarly, you can kind of incentivize private sector to grow, but you can't actually make them invest. But in the case of public sector undertakings, it's ultimately the government is the largest shareholder. So without using the balance sheet of the fisc of the government is actually able to, kill two birds with one stone, not show fiscal consolidation, but at the same time ensure that the PSUs are able to, give that final impetus for growth. So power is something that Vijay spoke about. So if you really think about solar power, 75 gigawatts is what we have at the currently. That's probably going to triple in the next 5 years. We have wind at 35. That's also going to go double. Then we have thermal at 225 gigawatt. That will also show a growth of 45. We are possibly the only country in the world where the power demand requirement is so much that we can grow on all the three. There are countries which are actually destroying the non-renewable sources and trying to replace it with renewable, whereas we are able to be, growing everything. So I think these are some examples. Then, of course, railways, roads, and all the other medium-term things that we have spoken about. All of them are very much, there. I think all of that is what is going to drive India going forward.
So, Vijay, let me get you again into a spot. You said you will not stick your neck in terms of predicting which sectors, but last year belonged to mid and small caps. Decent returns and good, and they outperformed the large cap stocks. But do you see some consolidation now happening in this segment of mid and small caps, or is there still some run expected on the sector? And obviously,
yeah, I think that's
quote a few of your favorite stocks in this segment.
So I think this is a question which many investors ask us, that whether they should cash out of mid cap because growth has really come in a big way in the last year. Yeah, sure. When you actually look at what happened, I think mid cap has been an outperformer. Mid and small cap, they've done extremely well, and actually the large caps have, to some sense, underperformed. But when you dissect what's happened in the mid caps and small caps and view it in the context of profit growth, which is what is supporting valuation, you'll find that these are not speculative expansion in market caps and market values. These are driven by improvement in PAT, improvement in margins. The Nifty has grown by about 15% in PAT, whereas the mid cap has been somewhere in the ballpark of 25%. So clearly, the momentum is supported by fundamentals. It is not out of the whack. That said, I think there are certain places where valuations have run up, and therefore, rather than a broad brush look at mid cap and small cap as a segment, I think one needs to pivot to a more specific story based investment theses. And we believe that there are number of stories still waiting to show continued growth and expansion. So to our mind, the mid cap and the small cap story is not over yet. Sure, there could be volatility, there could be transient corrections, but I think that's par for the kind of returns that one can eventually get if you get the right stocks there. The other angle which becomes very unique when it comes to mid-cap and small caps in the Indian context is, Prasanna just spoke about the fact that we are having lots of legs for growth of the country, and we all believe that next several years should be, a nominal growth of in the ballpark of 7.5, 8, give or take, some such number. And when an economy is expanding by that ratio, by that kind of a percentage on a sustained basis, you will find that a number of mid caps of today are going to become large caps of tomorrow. It's going to happen. We've seen that in the past, and probably it will happen in a larger number. Just to give you some interesting data here, companies which had more than 100 crores of profit in 2017, just 6 years back, was a little over 200. There were about 230 companies who had 100 crores. So just imagine, it's 100 crore is not a very large number. Today that number has crossed 800 companies. During this 6 years, economy has doubled, but the number of companies which are in the small mid range has gone up 4 times. So you'll get an alpha if you focus on the right mid caps. They are capable of growing at a faster clip than the average economy. So clearly, there are number of stories in the mid-cap space which can become large caps of the future, which probably today large caps do not even enjoy. For example, e-commerce. There are no e-commerce sort of players who are in the large cap space. The hotels, tourism related sectors, hospitals. There is going to be, even insurance sector has sort of underperformed. So much of underpenetration exists there. So there is a lot of value creation that can happen in the sector, which can outperform and give you a great alpha, but you have to stick to the right stories. So I would sort of say that don't run away from mid-cap and large cap yet, but it's not a broad-brushed approach, it's a specific approach, and massive value creation outperformance can happen if you get the stories right. So that would be, and don't worry about transient volatility if you have got the story right. Even the right story guys could show transient volatility, but I think the temperament to stay with such stories could lead to massive wealth creation.
Conceptually and fundamentally, you have sold me on this idea of stay with this stock, but you have not answered me any favorite stocks.
Yeah, I think rather than favorite stocks, I would rather stick to some themes, some sectoral themes. I would still say that from a medium-term sector, some of the areas that I did mention, I think e-com is a great play. Railway ancillaries are a great play. Defense ancillaries, indigenization is a great play. NBFCs focused on consumption is another interesting play. Hotels is premiumization is another interesting play. Hotels, tourism-related players are a good play, and many of them are sort of hidden gems sitting in the Indian markets. So I would believe that some of these not so traditionally sort of tracked sectors are going to be value creators of the futures.
I'm sure that you've given some ground rules for some of them to just think through which are these names which will fit into this pocket of investment. Prasanna, broadly from an Indian rates and currency perspective, how do you look at the markets? Because a lot of things are being spoken into from inflows, bond inclusion index, things are looking good. So just to keep it short and simple, what will be your view in terms of the currencies?
Right. So I think first of all, the basic question that you need to answer, if you have to answer asset class questions, is what is going to happen with the Reserve Bank of India. So like I briefly mentioned, I think the RBI is just about to start cutting rates sometime later in this part of the year, but but I think it's going to be a shallow rate cut cycle. So let's assume that they're going to cut in the region of around 50 basis points, maybe towards the last quarter of this year and one cut towards the beginning of next year. This is of course assuming that the Fed starts somewhere soon. The beyond this, what is going to happen to Indian bonds, for example? Like the demand-supply situation for bonds is so good, so positive, that the same thing, the financialization of savings, which has been helping equity markets, has also helped Indian bond markets, because you've seen a lot of money coming into bonds through insurance companies and long-term investors. So that has really helped or prevented Indian bond yields from going up, even when US yields were going up. And to add to it, you have this bond index inclusion where nothing less than $20 to $30 billion of inflows are going to come in over the next 12 months. So A, you're going to have an impending rate cut from the Reserve Bank sometime during the year, and B, you're going to have a very good demand-supply situation. So we're looking at the 10-year bond in the region of 6.75 to 7.05 kind of levels. So that's something that is very safe to bet on. Beyond bonds, if you have to look at equities, of course, Vijay gave a very positive view, and we also share a similar such view on the equity asset classes, that things are looking good. And in fact, all the investors and FPIs that we met over the last couple of days are all literally waiting for a correction and are really unhappy that the correction is not long lasting. So I think that is something that is a classic case. As far as currency is concerned, one interesting development is that while India deserves to have an appreciating currency just purely from the BOP and the external account that I spoke about. But because of the strength of the dollar and the weakness of the emerging market currencies, Indian rupee is unable to appreciate. And hence you see depreciation pressure happening occasionally. But the Reserve Bank has managed the rupee so well that they have actually kept it quite stable. And the policy itself seems to be to keep it stable so that FDI investor or a long-term equity investor finds a non-rupee, a dollar investor, when he looks at equity investing into India, if he thinks the currency is stable, that is an added incentive for him to think about investing in India beyond the multiples and other things. So I think RBI has done a great job to prevent rupee from depreciating as well. But at the same time, whether they will make it appreciate is a big deal, because once it appreciates, you will have, competitive pressures, because you will have China yuan depreciating, and if rupee is appreciating, then the competitiveness of Indian manufacturers gets compromised. So to that extent, I think it's going to be a range-bound kind of a dollar-rupee movement over the next 6 months to a year.
So I think you have predicted for the 10-year G-Sec 675 to 705. Any prediction for the rupee in the next 1 year? Where will it?
So I think it's could look at 82.75 to 84.25.
That's a very broad range. Thank you so much, Vijay and Prasanna. I think whatever I thought could be of interest to the audience to listen, but we are very happy. Maybe we can just another last 5 minutes for a quick Q&A and any kind of questions that the audience would like to pose.
We need to have somebody to pass on the mics.
I thought I'll take the initiative to pivot the discussion a little to a darker spot. High Commissioner mentioned about Singapore's food security. And being an old student out of India, studying Indian economics, still agriculture is the fundamental driver of India. We used to have 70% of Indian population in economy and agriculture. We've moved to something like 25% of the GDP is still agriculture, 23 or 25%. Half of India's population is engaged still in agriculture. India is a country of 665,000. I don't know if there are more villages made. There are more states made in India, but I think villages remain to be about the same. Agricultural productivity has been a challenge. When we talk about manufacturing, the biggest opportunity India has perhaps is food processing. Out of 800 districts of India, one district can completely provide food security to countries like Singapore or more, completely. But I think this needs a fair amount of envisioning. In the last 10 years, while some interesting policy statements have been made, I think agriculture is always between policy and prayer. The prayer works better for India because the monsoon happens and you pray well and things do turn, and 1 or 2 bad monsoons can make it very difficult. I'm not sure your footprint as ICICI on the agriculture side of it. I think you do have a division and have brought in some technology to reach the farmers in India. My real concern and view would be that is such a large piece of Indian economy. While we talk about manufacturing, we used to have in India at a point in time food processing ministry. There's nothing like that today, I suppose. I think where is it heading in terms of policy? Because you hear things like, I want to use, instead of food, agricultural nutrients, want to use Ayurveda and homeopathy for the plants. Well, it's a very long drawn game. Technology to come into it, transformation of the farm holding structure, the transformation of productivity in it, that will have a big kicker for the Indian economy. And somehow this seems to be a blind spot. Am I being fair in my comments? And what do you think should be the policy beyond the prayers?
Sir, I think you made a fantastic point. So it is very difficult for us or for me to counter any of the things that you have said. The number of people who are dependent on agriculture, it's all true. India is a land of farmers. But also bear in mind, there are two things in the development or evolution of any economy or any country. So one, you transform from agriculture to manufacturing and then go to services. India has been an economy which has gone from agriculture directly to services, bypassing the manufacturing boom. So I think the policy is to, figure out how we can, get the next level of people to move into other areas which can, give them some growth. And the reason why that is important, by definition, agriculture is not something that can, transform an economy beyond a certain level of productivity changes, whereas manufacturing and services can do much more. So that is why when even in developed economies you have, the source of agriculture is much, much lesser and manufacturing and services is far higher. Having said that, I think this government is not shying away from agricultural reforms. It is still working on roads. Roads don't think that it is only for you and I to, drive to a holiday destination. It is also for farm produce to reach the marketplace as quickly as possible. They are also looking at logistics to reduce the logistic cost. And they are able to, look at all of this from a very holistic scenario as to how do I get better productivity. It will take a long time because it involves a whole lot of people in the process. And also if you have to look at job driven growth, I think construction is one area which is close. It is between agriculture and manufacturing. So you get more and more people to get out of agriculture to work into construction jobs. That is something that will also add to a lot of job growth in the economy. So I guess some of what you said or most of what you said is also very relevant and valid. But whether it can be a one solution that can kind of give answer to all of that is very difficult. All we can say is that the kind of policies that the government is pursuing seems to be in the right direction. I can see that you're nodding your head away, so you're not agreeing. We can have a chat after this conference. But I think they are doing a lot of stuff, and there are some questions which cannot be answered very easily. So I think let's leave it at that for the time being. Maybe we can, chat up. Yeah. I can see you have very strong views, but...
One last comment. I think there is learning for the government, including, you mentioned Chandrababu Naidu is coming the third time perhaps as Chief Minister. Never forget India's farmers and rural and the big lessons to be learned. And if that transformation they can address properly, I think you'll have a huge kicker of an advantage. That's the only point I wanted to make. Thank you.
While a lot of things are positive, there are a couple of sort of negative stories floating around, and I'd like you to comment on it. One is the entire risk of sort of subprime and unsecured loans. And I think recently there's an article by Ashok Modi calling it India's sort of subprime situation. And could you comment on that in terms of how real that is? Because I think they're clubbing a lot of other loans also within the subprime. So I'd like you to comment on what the risks are. And secondly, this whole thing about debate on manufacturing versus services. Is there, what is the outlook on some of the new sectors that, India is trying to build around the ecosystem? There's sort of a pushback from certain quarters that we shouldn't do manufacturing at all. Could you please comment on both those?
Yeah, so on the subprime.
Okay. So on the unsecured loans bit, see, I think data is being used by a lot of new age fintech companies to on-lend based on the kind of spending pattern and consumption behavior that people are showing on their respective apps. And that, I think, has become a reasonable, in terms of overall size as a percentage, it's still negligible. But if you look at Y-on-Y growth, or if you look at the size, it is reasonably high growth. And that is, I think, one of the reasons why the Reserve Bank has come down quite heavily on this particular aspect of loans. And I can say, and the other aspect is not just on unsecured loans, but the loans which are driving capital market investments.
Correct.
And that is something that the government is worried about, the Reserve Bank is worried about, and rightly so, because if you're in a situation where you think you can borrow at 8% or 9% or 10% and make 25% return in the equity markets, you can make money sometimes, but you might not be able to make it all the time. So obviously it leads to no asset creation, but at the same time some loans are getting created. So I think from that perspective, the kind of policies that, or the kind of instructions that Reserve Bank has come out is, I think, very laudable, and it kind of nips in the bud a potential risk that can become big at a later stage. So I think we need to appreciate how quickly the regulators have come down on that. And in terms of the new sectors, I'll just say a couple of things before I hand over to Vijay. I think, see, for example, I mentioned about power sector, right? So the fact that we need to come out with a renewable source of power is something that is a new sector, and that is going to drive growth from a large perspective, not only in India but in the entire world. Second thing is, things like EVs. You have now an entire production bottom line which is going to happen through production of cars which are EV enabled, and hence the entire ecosystem of batteries and other stuff which are need to be produced for those kind of companies. So I think some of these new age sector, e-commerce which I spoke about, so some of these new age sectors are also things that are going to be a very important part and parcel of the growth that India is going to possibly look at.
Yeah, I'll just add two bits to what Prasanna said in terms of the subprime risk. I think that's a very strong statement to make. I think Reserve Bank has come out with a slew of regulations just to ensure that when the going is good, people, the entities don't take the situation out of control. This is a good time to put these curbs and control. So one should read these regulatory action from that point of view, that no one can take ignore risk, and wherever pockets of risk are building before it gets out of hand, bring in regulations to control it. There are a few small entities which are in the fintech nature, which have sort of created what one would call credit surrogate based unsecured lending, which has gotten into trouble. But the size of these entities in terms of the systemic exposure is very, very small. So it doesn't really add to a systemic kind of a risk situation. But one thing is very clear, and I'll augment what Prasanna said, that the other concern that the regulator has got is that, is this unsecured lending flowing to capital markets? And they clearly want to curb that activity. So that's the other angle which is also driving it, more than real risk of defaults.
And in fact, the guideline also very clearly states that, one, the provision that you have to make for unsecured itself has gone up for the banks, and even the banks lending to NBFCs, which in turn lead to these capital market investments to retail investors. Even there, the provisioning has gone up. So it's like really clamping and saying that we know where the money is going. You better be careful before you start lending into these segments. So I think that's one way to corroborate that they are keenly looking at the equity markets.
the 4th of June result, irrespective of the politics of it, tells us that there was a government which thought it was going to be doing much better in terms of number of seats, while actually the opposite happened. And the swing between what it expected and what actually happened is quite substantial, which clearly means there is discontent of some kind on the ground. One source is what you talked about, which is the farmers and agriculture and rural sector. But I'd like to talk about the second one, which is jobs. And the whole issue of jobless growth that we have not been able to really address in the last 10 years, and in fact even before that, but it's getting worse because of the impact of technology. Some statistics, I am from the IIM background, and IIT Kanpur had a 42%, they couldn't place 42% of the students. This is IIT. Engineering colleges have not placed a substantial number of their graduates. IIMs, I know, through channels have been desperately trying to get alumni to recruit. They all completed placement, but after a lot of effort using the channels. Now, if this is happening in the premier institutes, what must be happening in the high school graduates, the lower end of the undergraduate segment? And with AI coming in, another statistic, this year, Infosys, TCS, Wipro, etc., recruited 1/10 of what they normally recruit every year. So the IT industry is obviously expecting a slowdown, if it's already not facing it, from the US buyers. So I think the job sector is going to become a much larger source of discontent, and in an alliance environment, this could pose uncertainty, not after 5 years, but even during the 5 years. I'd like some thoughts on that.
So, sir, again, great points. Can't dispute any of the things that you said. In fact, whenever we have spoken about the Goldilocks scenario, we have always mentioned job-driven growth as one potential source which the government should tackle, and not the jobless kind of growth. But AI, for example, the point that you were making, to look at IT companies' recruitment and say that the recruitment is coming down and hence they're not able to grow, I think might not be entirely right. In fact, the way I would look at it is they are able to achieve growth in revenue with far lesser headcount than what they were doing earlier. And one of it is productivity increase due to tools like AI. I think that's the way I would look at it. So what is happening is there are companies which are able to, increase productivity. But that is not to take away that there is a job growth problem. Now, again, to look at IIT, IIMs, so I think there are concerns. I mean, it's a valid concern to say that what's going to happen on the job side. In fact, whenever people ask us in terms of what could go wrong, everything is looking good, I think clearly it is the job, the entire demographic dividend is built on the ability of a country to provide jobs for the humongous amount of people who are coming into the job market. Obviously, the risk factor is if you're not able to do it. Now, all I can possibly take comfort and try to say here is that this is a government which understands some of these concerns and tries to look at it from a longer term perspective. Education is again something that they are started looking at. Immigration, trying to send more people abroad into countries which requires influx of immigrants is again something that I've seen the current external affairs minister talking about it. And so somewhere I feel that some of the risk factors which we feel are potential problems, if it is not recognized as a risk factor, that is where the first problem is. But at least this is a government which is actually able to recognize it. So I think from that perspective, they are very much seized of the situation. Whether it will actually turn out like the way you're painting out or whether it will turn out a little better is something for us to see, but not to say that that risk factor does not exist. Yes, it does exist. Vijay?
I think from that perspective, you're right. So what the opposition really claimed to fame is these three agenda that they really carried on, saying youth joblessness, poverty still prevailing, inflation and other things. But just to give two points on that. One, if you look at from the GCC, which is the Global Collaborative Centers or the Global In-House Centers, where a lot of MNCs, whether it is from the US or any other European countries, all of them are looking at India as their new destination, and this is going to be employment for the Indian youth. So the kind of setup that all these GCCs are happening, in fact, just to give examples, we were speaking to some of the big fours. I think they are planning to put about another 50,000 to 1 lakh people in the next couple of years just in those 4 big fours in their global collaborative centers. And I think there are a lot of these companies which are looking at India. So maybe that's one part of it which will happen. And second, I think from a government initiative, we've also heard from a lot of clients that the demographic is here for you to take advantage only when you put your skin in the game and come, put your money, establish, manufacture, create employment, and then you have the benefits of the local market as well as for what you want to do as exports, and then you enjoy the benefits of this demography. So I think that's one initiative from the government. And second, the natural pull of the Indian demographic is also helping a lot of these MNCs, GCCs and multinational companies to come and set up offices out here, which will again provide employment. But of course, there is no direct answer because what we are addressing today is a small portion, but long way to go.
Yeah, the issue is that the GCC sector in IT and BPO, which I come from, is going to shrink as it grows its revenue, as you rightly said. And therefore, it's being a source of a large portion of the recruitment from the institutions is not going to be as high as it used to be in the past.
Agreed.
Which means there has to be other sectors that has to take up this talent. We have 30 million young people coming into jobs every year, coming into job-ready stage every year. And that's the peak that we have reached right now. So it's the single biggest problem we have as a country. And while the macros look very good, there is this brewing problem which needs to be addressed very, very fast.
Agreed.
Classic case of how good the capital is being used to produce versus how much of labor is being used to produce the same output. I think economies go through all of this at various stages. So yes, there is this risk, and I think the government has seized of it. So the way I'm trying to say is that they will try to now take suggestions on job-driven growth and try to implement policies. Construction, that is why they are focusing so much on construction, is not just to build the roads. It is to provide so much of employment to people who are, at the cusp of agriculture.
Maybe one last question, I think.
Okay, let me start off by saying that definitely India is an incredible story. They have done a commendable job. But in terms of the equity markets, what do you think is the biggest risk factor that India has? And again, with the background that we saw massive bloodbath on the streets on 4th of June, wherein despite the fact that retail investors put in about 21,000 crores, foreign investors, they pulled out about 12,000 odd crores, and mutual funds pulled out about 6,000 odd crores. So that day, actually, we all relived the memories of COVID, where the markets tanked by about 8% intraday. That's one. And secondly, given the fact that we are all reading about this whole credit and deposit growth rate, which is at a decadal high, and as a result of which all the banks have announced increase in deposit rates, which will potentially impact NIMs of all leading banks, and potentially the credit growth as well going forward. So what do you think, will that hamper the equity run that we are witnessing right now? Thank you.
Yeah, so let me come in. I think this is a question, again, we keep asking ourselves on a regular basis as to what are the risks that we see. I think currently, as we spoke about, we sort of ticked off many factors which are actually risk factors, but we are sort of taking a view that they are not really going to play out. But indeed, if they play out, for instance, today we've assumed continuity of the government for 5 years. We've spoken about it as a given, right? Markets are taking it as a given, and that's why they are at that value. If that does not play out, and is that a possibility? I think to be seen. I think certainly market will react very negatively if something like that happens. If there is a breakdown in the policy continuity, fiscal consolidation, welfare schemes overtaking, we all are today assuming that, we will be able to manage the whole consolidation roadmap without really dislodging it, and still trying to meet the welfare measures or the other populist measures that may require to be rolled out. If they do not play out, I think that's another risk factor. Markets are assuming that globally there is no big event which is going to sort of derail the stuff. No geopolitical events are going to play out which are again going to derail the story. Markets are assuming stable oil prices. So I would say that all these factors, if they don't play out, something goes wrong on the oil, geopolitics, global interest rate cycle turns adverse, there's a recession and not a soft landing in US, the policy continuity in the country not happening, or fiscal consolidation path being taken away, detoured from. I think these are all risk factors, because today market is saying tick, 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 tick to everything, which is not necessarily played out. It is a call that the market is taking. So I would consider all of these as risk factors.
And on the issue of deposit credit growth that you were talking about, there are two important things that I think we need to realize. One is the liquidity tap is controlled by Reserve Bank of India. So at the end of the day, if RBI decides to open it, the liquidity will flow in. So I don't think a high credit growth with a low deposit growth, which is what I think you are alluding to, is not a systemic risk. It is something that the Reserve Bank has kept it like that, and the minute they feel that you can go into an easy policy regime, they can easily open it up. So it's not a big deal. The second point is, what is happening to the nature of deposits that a bank is attracting? So earlier, when financialization of savings or financialization of equity markets was not so high, you could see households investing A, in real estate, and then B, in fixed deposits of commercial banks. Now, because of the taxation structure becoming a little bit more even, or rather more attracted towards equities, and the equity cult coming in, the nature of this deposits in the banking system is shifting from fixed term deposits to a little bit of current account deposits. So you're seeing people investing in mutual fund schemes. Mutual funds have current account running with commercial banks, and effectively that money will come into the commercial bank as a current account. So I think the nature of the deposit is shifting, so that is what you need to take into account. And the third is this deposit rate increase that happened very recently, I think was not right reporting. I don't think that increase really happened. If you really go and check the deposit rates of that bank which was touted to have increased, it has not changed over the last 1 week to 10 days. It was to some extent some changes which was misreported, and that is the reason why it came. But your point is right, that if rates are going up when everything else is going, when RBI is easing rates, then it is something that we need to be worried about. But I think the answer lies in the fact that we are undergoing a capital marketization of Indian markets. More money flowing into capital markets, less money flowing into the historical loan deposit kind of market. So I think to some extent mutual funds are taking up the mantle from commercial banks. If at all, it is a sector issue that you need to think about. Is commercial banks well placed to grow as they were in the past versus a mutual fund? Is he better placed to grow? It is not a systemic problem that you need to be worried about, because the tap is ultimately controlled by Reserve Bank. When it opens, the liquidity will flow in.
So I think for paucity of time, I think. Okay.
Yeah, so I had a question. You spoke about the stability of the currency, which for the last 12 to 18 months, the RBI has kept it in a very, very narrow range. Obviously makes it a much more viable investment destination when somebody's looking at it in terms of a dollarized return. Two counterpoints to that. The first is that last December, we had the IMF come out and classify our currency arrangement as, they said, we've moved away from floating to a stabilized arrangement kind of thing. And the RBI pushed back quite aggressively against that. Basically saying that if you looked at it over a 2 to 5 year horizon, then that was not the case, which is correct, because this is a policy that's been in place for about 12 to 18 months. But the longer you hold this policy, the tougher it becomes to fend off criticism like this. So what do we do? Do we think this policy holds going forward? And the second I think more pertinent risk is that because we are holding dollar INR in a very narrow range, if you are an exporter or an importer who's exposed to non-dollar risks, let's say you're importing from China or from the Eurozone, then effectively the volatility that you're seeing in your income stream has actually gone up because you're effectively seeing a euro-dollar volatility now. So your thoughts on that?
No, I think your second point is perfectly valid. I think excessive focus on just one pair, which is INR dollar, means that Euro INR or Yen INR or Pound INR will be that much more volatile. So nothing to take away from your question, and I think all I can say is from my interactions with whether it's the governor or with his team of people. Of course, they never say that they target a particular level of exchange rate on the pair, but they try and kill undue volatility. Somewhere I also feel that internationalization of the rupee and the de-dollarization as a thematic which has started is something which some of the governments have started thinking about as to how do we make our currency stable from a longer term perspective, which will then enable international investors to think about this currency also as an alternative potential to the dollar. I agree that it is way off, and I mean it is not something that can be achieved by any currency. Fact that euro itself was supposed to do that over the last 10-15 years and we are nowhere near that means that it's not an easy game. But at the same time, I think some push is happening towards that, and that's one of the reasons why I think INR has been kept stable. So if you were to ask me what do I think about the policy on the INR dollar going forward, I would assume that we would see more of the same, which is to say that any undue volatility in INR, I mean, what is undue, you can of course argue, but any incremental volatility which is beyond an assumed level will be possibly killed by the Reserve Bank is what the policy that I think they will follow. And what was your first?
How do we fend off future criticism from the IMF? Because last time we fended off by saying that.
Yeah, but I think, I don't know what the repercussions of being classified as a currency violator is. It's not very clear. And the fact of the matter is, I mean, today you can even call Japan as a currency violator because they are intervening left, right and center to prevent the yen from depreciating, but the market is not letting it appreciate. So I'm not very sure. There are times when, of course, US doesn't intervene in the currency market as much, but it is also a fact that every country follows a policy which benefits its own. And the US has been very clear that we want to do what is correct for the US. And when emerging markets have to take a hit because of excessive, let's say, interest rates on the US side or excessive cuts on the US, there have been in the past US cutting interest rates to zero, emerging markets getting a huge inflow of money, which the central banks of the emerging markets knowing that will create a problem in the future. And the US argues, we will do what is good for us. It's up to you to manage the problem. So I think beyond a point, I think every country is answerable to its own stakeholder, which is its own population. And I think we'll have to take a call as to what they think is good for that particular country. So to just prevent us from being classified as a currency manipulator by the US is, I don't think is a policy which is worth pursuing. Yes, there has, I mean, nothing works in extreme. So if there is excessive intervention which is required, maybe you need to tone it down a little bit. I suspect that if the yuan were to depreciate a lot, or if other emerging market currencies were to depreciate a lot, I think the Reserve Bank will let INR also, depreciate a little bit to ensure that the cost competitiveness of exporters does not get frittered away. But beyond that, I don't think this particular aspect is something that should be a policy objective. That's my personal opinion.
Should take the opportunity to thank each one of you all for taking time on a Friday evening and attending this conference, and I hope you all have found answers to certain questions, and certain questions we will try and go back to our drawing board to find a little more detailed answers. Thank you so much. Please do join us for cocktail and dinner, and a special thanks to His Excellency and High Commissioner Dr. Shilpa Gamble for taking time, spending it out here with us and hearing our questions and hearing the audience share their perspectives. And thank you so much, sir. And have a good day and good evening for all. Thank you so much.